for joining us for another episode of Mid-American Gardener. I'm your host, Tanisha Spain, and joining me in the studio today is one of our panelists that you recognize from our older shows when we used to do the panels, which seems like forever ago. Kay Carnes is joining us today. So Kay, before we jump into the things that you brought in our discussion, tell the folks a little bit about you and where they can find you.
Well, they can find me in my garden out in Monticello, and they can find me in Allerton Park because I volunteer there as well. They have an herb garden there, which I help them with, and so that's basically where you find me.
And that's where we find you. And Kay, you're our herbs and heirloom panelist.
I am.
So anytime we've got herb and heirloom questions, Kay is the one. So we've been talking about seed starting, we've been talking about plants, and even though it's chilly and it's spring, we're getting closer and closer to really having those cool crops. It's about time for that.
That's right.
Tell us what you've brought today. Now, did you start these from seed?
Yes, I did.
Okay, what do you got?
This is a broccoli. It's not wanting to stand up very much in this pot, but it's an Italian variety called Calabrese, and it'll get quite large, and the main head will come out first, and they can be anywhere from 6 to 8 inches in diameter.
Oh, wow.
But what I like about it is once the main head is cut, it sends up a lot of side shoots, and they'll have smaller heads.
Ooh.
And it'll do that from the beginning until we cut them down in the fall.
Really?
Yeah.
So you'll enjoy harvest from these all season.
Yeah.
Wow.
They do get a little smaller as they get older, but still it's enough, for if you've got 4 or 5 plants, it's enough for a meal. So that's a really nice one. And this is kale. It's called a Scarlet Kale, and you can't really see it quite as well now, but when it gets older, it has red in it, red streaks. And I really like it a lot for, cooking and eating. And they really get big. I had one last year, and the stalk on it was probably
wow,
several inches across. And these are cool weather crops, so they really should be going in right now. I got them started a little bit late this year, so these are ready to go in, and as soon as this current bitter cold
if and when it ever wraps up, right? We're just waiting.
I mean, just 50s would be great for these plants, but
the
30s and 20s at night, they don't care for very much. So these will go in pretty soon.
Okay. So when you start your seeds, and we've talked about this a little bit before on the show, you like to kind of amend the potting mix or the seed mix that you can get in the store. And I know a lot of people like to put their own twist on it and kind of blend different things to get the best potting soil. So now give us your secrets.
Okay, so let's see. So first of all, this is the potting soil, and I grow so much stuff. I get the compressed bales of potting.
Oh, wow. You're big time.
So, well, they last 2 or 3 years. So they really are compressed. So you have to get in and break them up. But that works. So this is
just straight out of the bag.
Straight out of the bag potting soil, and that's good to use. I mean, you can certainly use that. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. So what I do is I add this is some compost that I've had. It's a little dry now, and.
Now, do you make your own compost as well?
I do. Sometimes this is some of a batch that I got from the Urbana Landscape Recycling Center.
Nice.
They have really nice compost. So, but I do have compost piles behind. We have an old corn crib on our property, and behind that, I take my scraps and just dump them in a pile and don't do any. I don't usually, once in a while, I'll turn it. But it actually makes really good compost. Yeah.
The magic just happens whether you turn it or not.
It certainly does. And then finally, the last thing add to it is core. That's shredded coconut. And this is really great because it helps hold moisture. And that comes in bricks
Yes.
that are compressed, and you just put them in a bucket with water and let them sit for a while, and it'll soak up the water. Potting soil alone is really hard to get wet.
Yes.
If you've used it. So the core really helps it hold the water and stay wetter longer.
John was talking about using core, mixing it with his blend as well, because it's lighter. And he said the seedlings have an easier time sort of breaking through in the beginnings. Is that one of the?
Yes, that does help.
Okay.
Although the potting soil stays fairly light.
Okay.
But yeah, it does. I love core. It just really helps a lot.
With the moisture. Now, do you use equal portions of all three of
No,
these?
I use primarily, I'd say maybe 2/3 potting soil.
Okay.
And the rest kind of half and half compost and core. The compost kind of feeds it, and the core helps keep with the water. So you don't need tons of it.
Okay, so 2/3 potting soil, write this down, this is the recipe. 2/3 potting soil.
Loosely.
Loosely. 1/3 of the compost and then 1/3 of the core. If you don't use core or all three components, are there 2 components of this that would work? Are there, if you...
I'd say the core and the potting soil.
Okay.
The compost in the potting soil would work because the compost would hold moisture a little better than the potting soil.
But all three is kind of the ticket.
Yeah, because you're feeding it with the compost and then you're watering it, keeping moisture with the core.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. And that, mix those together, and that's how you come up with your medium for your seedlings. Awesome. Okay.
Yep.
We had a question come in about compost, since you mentioned that earlier. 2 questions, actually. This is from Susan Biskner-Iverness. Her first question is, she says, I dig plants in spring that I want to give away. It wants to know if it's okay to use pure compost as the planting medium. Wants to know if it's too rich or if it would be acceptable. So we were kind of joking about this before the show, but what are your thoughts on using compost as your medium?
Well, you could. It's not like fertilizer where it can burn the plants. It's more natural, but it's, it's kind of expensive, or not expensive, but
precious. Like,
it's a little overkill for one thing.
Yeah.
You don't need that much.
Yes.
And you're wasting really good compost. So I would mix something else, potting soil or something else with
Unless you've just got an abundance and you're just swimming in compost.
It's certainly not going to hurt the plant.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. But maybe you just don't need it all. All right, and the second part of her question is, can I add used paper products? And in the parentheses, she's got napkins, thin paper plates, paper towels to the compost. She had heard rumblings that using the white, like with this paper plate or paper towels, has bleach in it, and was concerned there. So what is your take on adding paper scraps to your compost?
Well, I wouldn't worry about the paper plates wouldn't dissolve as well. Paper towels, if they didn't have any ink on them, if they were just plain white, and like just white toilet paper and Kleenex would probably be okay. But something that's kind of, this isn't hard, but
it's almost like it's coated.
Well, a lot of them are.
Yeah.
Most paper plates are coated with. So I would worry about that, and it would take for years to decompose.
Any other things around the house that you can think of that have been helpful? What do you throw in your pile? You mentioned your garden scraps, but anything from the house?
Food scraps.
Food scraps?
Anything that doesn't have oil in it. Leftover vegetables, leftover fruit peelings.
Banana peels.
Yeah, well, I don't usually use banana peels.
Really?
But, they would probably take a long time to break down.
Gotcha.
but certainly like potato peelings, anything like that. I have a little container by my sink where all that stuff goes, and then I've got a big bucket on the back porch, so I empty that, and then coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are great.
Yes. And there is a recipe to composting as well, and I'm not quite familiar with that. I know you've got to have a good mix of your browns, and there's a thing in there about the recipe. I'm not quite familiar.
Yeah, I don't follow a recipe. I just dump it all in the pot.
Just dump it all in there, and it's working.
But see, if you live I live out in the country, and we have acreage, and we're surrounded by crop fields, so I can pretty much do. But in town, it might be a little, wouldn't be such a, it might be a problem.
Sure.
And you'd have to be careful, but it's, if you have a small area, it's going to be fine. But you can put a lot of things in it.
Interesting. We'll have to find some materials from the extension and post about composting and recipes and kind of maybe some tips to get folks started. So, well, anywho, Kay, thank you so much for stopping by the studio. That went really fast. And hopefully we'll be able to check back in with you a little bit later as things are growing, and we'll see how your garden is doing.
Maybe next time I'll have tomatoes.
And that's the other one. Kay is a huge tomato grower, so yes, we'll be looking forward
and
to
mine
those.
I just got them in the flats, and they germinated. I don't know what it was about this year, but everything germinated really quickly.
Anxious,
my
just
broccoli,
like us.
the kale came up in 2 days.
Wow.
And the broccoli in 3, and the tomatoes, which usually take a couple of weeks, came up in 4 or 5 days.
They're eager.
I don't know.
We'll take that as a sign.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Kay, for stopping by. And if you've got questions you'd like our panelists to answer, please send us an email to yourgarden@gmail.com, or you can look us up on Facebook. Just search for Mid-American Gardener and send us a message there. And now we are joined by Sarah Vogel in the studio. Is this your first time coming in person?
This is.
Wow, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. So first, introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about you, your background, and kind of where we can find you outside in the garden.
All over in the garden. I'm Sarah Vogel. I'm the horticulture educator for Illinois Extension. I cover DeWitt, Macon, and Piatt counties. My background is in both forestry and horticulture. And so you can find me most of the time, my head in the clouds or looking up in the trees, and oftentimes my hands in the soil.
There we go. That sounds pretty perfect, actually. Yeah. So you did join us virtually during our shows during the pandemic. So it's really nice to meet you in person and be joined in studio. So spring has sprung, even though it sort of doesn't feel like it. If you've got things in your yard that are kind of peeking up above the soil, you're not alone. And so one of the biggest things that we love here are hostas. And so Sarah is going to walk us through just how to take care of them, if you're going to split them, transplant them other places. She's got some great photos from this year and last year, and she's going to just walk us through how to take care of them and show them a little extra love as we're moving. So I will let you take it away here and tell us what we're seeing and give us some tips.
Sure. So as you mentioned, a hosta is a very commonly used perennial. One of the most commonly known, I guess, facts that gardeners know about hostas is that they kind of appreciate a little bit of shade. There are some hostas that will do well in full sun, but as you can see from this first picture, they'll take full sun, but if they aren't also receiving adequate water, you might see some symptoms of sun scald. So that's, if you're starting to see these browned edges and things, you might make sure they're getting adequate water if we aren't getting enough rainfall. The reason I wanted, oh, by the way, this is a cultivated variety of hosta called Empress Wu. That will get it's a very large leaf hosta, and it's a large size, mature size hosta. So it's mature size is about 3.5 feet tall.
Oh, wow.
And every bit of probably 5 feet across.
3.5 feet. I don't think I've seen a hosta that big.
And so, yeah, it's huge. It's huge. It's really an impressive size leaf and plant. And then the flower stalks, once they bloom, I'm 5'3" and I'm eye to eye with them. So pretty large plant for a hosta. But it's a beautiful plant. It's done really well in the site I have it, even though it's not the best soil. They do like a little bit better soil. But as you can see from the picture with the heuchera, it's starting to become large enough. It's starting to encroach upon some of my other perennials. Hostas don't have to be divided. If you want to let your hostas grow into an herbaceous hedge for the growing season, certainly you can do that. Oftentimes gardeners prefer to keep them nice and neat in one shaped plant, so that's often why we divide them.
Now, let me ask you about the sun. Did you say sun scald?
Sun scald.
Sun scald. Is there anything else that could sort of mimic that?
Probably there are some other things that could mimic that.
But just knowing if you're watering enough and kind of paying attention to the moisture level.
Right.
Because sometimes, sometimes we get out there and we think, oh, this must be sun scald, and it could be something else. So I just didn't know if there were any ways to determine if it needed a second look, maybe. Sun
scald is going to be one of your first things you could address, those environmental stressors, those abiotic factors, by making sure, again, the adequate water, that it has the shade that it needs, good soil. Maybe you mulch with a little bit of compost and use that, incorporate it into the soil. So yeah, there may be other things that mimic it, but that's one of the first things that we could, we could address.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you were talking about a little bit of overcrowding here.
I really want to keep that purple heuchera where it is, and so I'm going to keep this Empress Wu hosta contained, and it's where it's supposed to be, in my garden anyway. So when we consider dividing our hostas, we wait until late March, early April, when we start to see these eyes, the growing points, the little tips coming out of the ground, or as my kids call them, the hosta horns.
Hosta horns, I like that.
That is kind of what they look like. And so we look for those. I use some leaf mulch and some other things to kind of cover up some of my perennial beds. So I pulled it back to see if they were coming out recently, and sure enough, they were. So that's what our picture is of the horns just emerging from the ground. And the diameter of those eyes coming out of the ground was probably about 14 inches around. So when I took my shovel to start digging them out to divide them, I went a little bit beyond that to make sure we have adequate, in case there's a few eyes that haven't emerged yet, we want to give adequate room. So you would take your spade and dig entirely around where the eyes are emerging, and then remove that whole clump as one whole thing. Even though you're only going to transplant maybe half or a third or quarter it, however you're going to divide it up, you want to take the whole clump out.
Okay.
And then once you do that, you can, if it's a smaller plant, often you can divide by your hand, just using your hands. This has been there for some time. And so some people use a sharp knife to cut it. I'm a barbarian. I'm just a simple caveman, so I just use my spade. A nice sharp spade will be useful in this case, and just slice right through it. Probably I could get maybe 3 or 4 divisions out of this. I'm going to only divide it into 2 because I want to keep a good size to the ones I have. And then once you get those apart, you want to try, when you're dividing it, to keep as much of the root attached to those clumps as possible.
Another question I wanted to ask. I have seen people not dig the entire root ball and just kind of take their spade and hack off in the ground the piece that they want to move. Why recommend against that?
So it's not a recommended practice, but it's probably going to work just fine.
Okay.
The reason we
I didn't
take
know
out,
if it was, something you shouldn't do, if it was a gardening no-no.
we kind of want to give whatever we're putting back in there, whatever we're going to leave in that spot, enough space to grow, enough room for those roots to establish, enough room for that plant to really become well established again. So if you're just hacking off part of it, yeah, it's probably going to work, but the recommended practice is to remove the entire clump.
Noted. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, where were you?
Not at all. No, so you can see by that last photo that we have really big fleshy roots that are attached to the hostas. And so, yeah, using my barbaric method with a shovel, I'll probably, damage a couple of the horns, a couple of the roots. But all in all, once I get those apart and they're planted and receive adequate water, they're going to do just fine. But you can see by that, again, that last photo, they are really large roots and they have rhizomes that come off of them. So that's what it helps them to spread in your garden.
So these pictures are recent. I mean, this is a project you're tackling now-ish.
That's right. That's right. So obviously the pictures of the fully emerged, nicely grown hostas, those first couple of photos came from years past. But yeah, this is a project that I have just recently tackled, and we'll be moving them, planting that second clump probably today, as a matter of fact.
I was just going to ask if, you know, that it's chilly and, you know, but it's okay to move them now.
Yeah, they're coming up right now, and it's, you know, March in Illinois, you know, as well as I, can be a roller coaster of temperature and moisture and emotions sometimes. So spring is for renewal, right?
Yes.
So I think the important thing is when we do move that clump is that we keep in mind the mature size of what that plant is going to be. So I knew that I crowded these this time. So when I take the new clump and put it in a separate location, I'm going to make sure it has adequate room to grow, and I'm going to water it adequately too, so those roots have a good chance of establishing.
I was just going to ask about the routine of actually putting it in the ground. I love when gardeners, and especially professionals, share tips of things like watering the hole and using compost. So can you walk us through some of your best practices that you literally apply at home when you transplant? Or you?
Oh, I don't know if I'm always the best. I don't always practice what I preach because I like to experiment a little bit.
No one does. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so, you know, whether it's a hosta, an herbaceous perennial like a hosta, or a woody perennial, or even your annuals, you want to really allow the plant enough room to grow. You keep the mature size of something in mind when you're choosing it. So that means not planting your maple tree right up next to the house or underneath a power line or things like that. That's one of the biggest tips that we can give anybody, is keeping the right plant in the right site, having those things in mind. And then aftercare. That is really one of the most, you know, proper planting and proper aftercare. So watering, if it's something that does need pruning, making sure you're doing those procedures too.
Do you feed or do any type of amendments when you transfer, or you do splitting? Just to give them a good start, or do you just plant, water, and let her go?
I don't usually amend when planting. I do often use compost as a mulch. Organic mulches are really great for several reasons. You're going to suppress weeds. You're going to get a little bit more moisture retention. You're going to be adding organic matter back into the soil. So mulching with something like compost or shredded leaves is a good practice. And with aftercare, yeah, watering is really important. I think that timing is probably one of the biggest inhibitors to a healthy plant. When we do things at the wrong time or not exactly the right time, and the plant doesn't like that. So just finding out what those proper practices are.
Okay, and we've got just a couple minutes left, and I like to ask everyone, what are you going to be growing at your house this year in the garden? Any special plants, any new varieties you're trying? What's on the list?
You know, this year I am taking a bit of a break from the vegetable garden.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm going, because I know we're going to be away a lot this summer.
Gotcha. The stress of being away and worrying about the garden.
Coming back to the weed festival that is going on. And so I'm going to take a break on that. I'll probably do a few different cover crops to, you know, put a little bit of nutrients back into the soil to improve the tilth of the soil. So I'll probably move away from that and just concentrate on my containers and my perennial beds and so on. I planted a lot of woody species, some trees and shrubs in the last couple of years, so making sure they have that aftercare, because once you put it in the ground, it's not done. You've got to take care of it after that.
That's just the beginning, right?
That's right. That's right. So, and we have a lot of deer in my neighborhood too, so making sure that any damage any havoc that they have wreaked is cleaned up.
I like that. So you're not exactly taking the year off, I mean, from vegetable gardening, but doing the cover crops and just kind of monitoring the health of those beds in that area, that's still kind of some work in itself. So excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming to the studio and talking to us about hostas. And I love the fact that you said paying attention to the future of the plant, the mature size, especially like with the hostas that you have. That's huge.
Yeah.
And so you had to think ahead, okay, this guy is going to spread and going to get, what'd you say, 3.5 feet tall? So
Yeah, and 5 feet wide. And it doesn't look like that when you buy it in a little quart or gallon. So keeping that mature size in mind is important.
excellent. All right, Sarah, thank you so much for stopping by the studio, and thank you so much for watching. And as always, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to see our panelists talk about, you can send us an email to yourgarden@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search for Mid-American Gardener, and you can send us a question there as well. And you may remember last spring we went to Ella's house. It was just about this time last year, and she taught us how to make maple syrup using the sugar maples that she had on her property. Well, I've got some sugar maples at my house as well, so we decided to give it a shot. And so we ordered some taps and tapped a few of the trees out at our place. So I put together a quick video to show you how that went one weekend. So here you see my husband. We've already drilled the hole in, and he is putting the taps in the tree, and it immediately started to run, which was great because we knew we had done it properly. In just a few hours, you'll see here in the next one that we had already collected that's a good 1/3, maybe almost a half gallon there of sap. As time went on throughout the day, just kept collecting more and more and more. The trees were running really good. This one was from the next morning. I emptied it about 5 in the evening, and that was the next morning when I went out. So that tree ran really well all day. Ella had the 2 roaster pans. I just have one because this is our experimental year. So dumping those in a roaster pan, just letting that water cook off of there. There you can see I'm emptying another one, and that one was totally full. And now we wait. So when that finishes up and we get that nice caramel color and the consistency that we're looking for, I'll know it's ready, and I'll have to bring in a sample and show you guys how it all turned out. So wish us luck. Thanks so much for watching and sticking with us throughout each iteration of the show. If you've got a question for us, send it in to yourgarden@gmail.com. You can also look for us on Facebook. Just search for Mid-American Gardener and send us a message there.